This is going to be one of the deja vu videos. We are going to review, explore, do some hands-on exercises with Flux v2, Flux with DevOps Toolkit. And it is deja vu because I already did that last week. And I did it terribly. I misunderstood the documentation, or documentation wasn't incomplete, or my brain did not work well. So I made some false claims in the previous Flux 2 video, which is now unlisted. You cannot watch it anymore, and so on and so forth. So if you didn't watch it, you will not be able to watch it. If you watched it, I apologize. We're going to do that again. We're going to explore Flux v2 with DevOps Toolkit. And let me tell you right away, it's awesome. And we are going to go through it because we all like GitOps. If you don't know what GitOps is, hey, here's a link. This explains what GitOps is. And because Flux is the main competitor of Argo CD, which is also awesome. I explored it, watched the video here, so I will assume that you understand how it works. Today, we are going to explore Flux v2 again. This is reviewed version, new version, and we're going to try to do that in 20 minutes or less. Let's start with what I have, and that's not much. All I created or did before recording this video is I created a cluster, a Kubernetes cluster, K8s cluster. That's it. In this case, it is Minikube cluster, but it could be any cluster we can imagine. Any Kubernetes cluster should do. Now, the scenario that I want to go through is to have two environments in this cluster, production and staging. Now, this is for simplicity reasons. I would normally have more. I would have also preview environments, maybe pre-production, whatsoever. I might have many environments, and those environments might be split into multiple clusters or different namespaces inside of that same cluster, and so on and so forth. But for today's exercise, I have a single cluster where I want to deploy staging and production, but I want those two things to be separate simply because those environments are separate from access control reasons, for repository organization reasons, and so on and so forth. So two environments, production namespace, separated in different namespaces inside of the same cluster. That's what I'm trying to accomplish today. I'm going to start by creating repositories, Git repositories, where I will store production manifests or references to manifests and staging. So make dir -p flux production. That will be the name of the repository, and I will have the directory apps inside. I will store the app manifests in the directory apps. And then I'm going to go into the directory flux production. I'm going to initialize Git. I'm going to create repository. It will be public, but you normally would do private, but for this exercise, public. And use the default values. That's all okay. Cool. And I'm going to create a README file, production, just so that I have something to push. And that will be readme.md. And I'm going to add the files and git commit those files to the repo. So I just created more or less empty repository. It has a README and not much more. And I'm going to push that set upstream origin master to the remote repository, to GitHub in this case. So just created the repository, nothing special happened so far. And inside of the cluster, I will create a namespace production. So I have a repository for production, and I have a namespace for production. Now I'm going to do the same thing for staging. Make dir flux staging and directory apps inside it. I'm going to go inside of that directory, And same thing, initialize Git. I'm going to create a repository. Okay, public, and default values. I'm going to create commit. I'm going to create a README. And add the files, commit the files, and push the files, set upstream master. Oh, that was a mistake. Set upstream origin master. Cool. And just as before with production, I'm going to also create a namespace staging, just as I did for production, and go back. So I have 2 repositories so far and 2 namespaces in my cluster. Nothing else, not more, not less. So I created a repository. This is Git production, and I created the repository, a Git repository, in this case in GitHub, that is staging. And that's all I have so far. Let's continue. Let's see what else do I need. Next, I will create a fleet repo. And that might sound like a strange name, but that is a repository where we will keep references to different environments, production staging, or any other environment we might have. And that is a repository where we will keep the setup, the installation, the manifests of Flux itself. And while we're at it, we're going to also install Flux. So, and in Flux terms, from CLI perspective, that's called Flux Bootstrap. So Flux Bootstrap. The repository is GitHub. It could be GitLab and a few others. Owner is going to be me. Repository is going to be Flux Fleet. Branch will be main. Path. Oh, that's typo. The path where we will store the definitions, the manifests, will be apps. Remember, we created that directory before, and it is going to be a personal repository. It could be organizational, private, company type of repository, but this is my personal, so personal should be okay. So what is happening right now is that CLI is connecting to GitHub. It created a repository, Flux Fleet. It created manifests, pushed them to that repository, and now it is installing Flux. And this is absolutely awesome because it is really showing that Flux is trying to apply GitOps principle everywhere, including on itself. Like if you go to Argo CD documentation, you will see that there is a lot of mambo jumbo, create this command, create that command to install Argo CD. And only after Argo CD is installed, Argo is really applying GitOps for real, but installation is finicky. In case of Flux, it applies GitOps from the very beginning and in a very guided tour. I didn't create the repo, I didn't create the manifest. Flux CLI did all that for me. It created all that stuff, pushed it to Git, and then it installed itself. And from now on, I can go to this repository, Flux Fleet in this case, and modify any aspect of Flux, and it will work. It will update itself. Now let's take a quick look at what did we get. kubectl -- namespace Flux system. That's where Flux installed itself, and get pods. And we can see that Flux is up and running. I will not go through the details of what each of those components means. This is a quick overview. Let me see where I am. Now I'm going to clone the newly created repository and see what did we get over there. And this is me and Flux fleet.git. By the way, I didn't mention before, all the commands that I'm running will be available in a gist. So go to the comment section and you will find the gist with all the commands. If you want to reproduce what I'm doing, The commands are in the gist. It's in the comment section. Cool. So I clone the repository. If I go there, Flux fleet, and if I output apps directory, we can see that there is Flux system subdirectory. And if we output that file, that directory, subdirectory, we can see geo, tk component, sync, customization. Those are the manifests that do a couple of things, but the most important in this context is that they define Flux itself, installation and maintenance of Flux, and they're telling Flux, and this is the most important thing, that this is the repo it should monitor. This is the source of the manifest. We're going to create a couple of other sources very, very soon. Actually, right now. Let's do it. So what do we need? Actually, let me go back to drawing board to show you what we got so far. So we got the third repository, and this is also Git repo, and it is fleet repo. And that repo contains manifests that are required for setup and maintenance of Flux. So some files were added here, and then Flux was installed inside of the cluster, and from now on, Flux is monitoring this repository. Every time something changes in this repo, it will be reflected in our cluster. The next thing we need to do is to tell Flux how to monitor the staging repository and how to monitor production, so that those two repositories are also applied in the cluster, that they define the desired state. And we're going to do that by creating a source file. We're going to create a source file, put it in this repo, and through that source file, tell Flux that there is a staging repo and that there is production. So sources will be referencing those two repos. Flux will pick up those source files, and from there on, Flux will monitor those two repositories. Let's do that part. So we're going to use Flux now CLI, and this is another awesome thing that I like about Flux. I don't have to create YAML files from scratch. I don't need to copy and paste files from somewhere. I can use the CLI to create the file for me. So let's do this. Create source. It's going to be Git. We're going to call it staging, and the URL of that source will be github.com and vfarsec and Flux staging. So this is the repository that we created initially, and we're going to specify a few more arguments like branch is going to be master, interval is going to be 30 seconds. So every 30 seconds this repository will be synchronized or checked whether there are changes, and we want to export the manifest created through this command. This command will not change anything in cluster, just create the manifest. And we're going to store that in the apps directory, and the file is going to be staging YAML. So all that this command did was create this file. It created this Git repository definition that is now inside of the local copy of my Flux field repository. Next, we are going to do the same thing for staging. So Flux create, it's going to be a customization this time. We are going to create a file, a customization, that typical Kubernetes customization, actually not typical, Flux specific customization reference that will tell Flux, hey, that staging source, that staging repository, here is how you convert that repository into manifests. This is the format and the path and so on and so forth. So customization, and it's going to be called staging as well. The source is staging. Now this is really important. This is telling Flux that the source is the one that we created earlier, the file actually that we created earlier. The path is going to be the root. Anything in the root of that repository should be considered the manifest. prune will be set to true, meaning that whenever we delete something from that repo, it will be removed from the cluster as well. Validation on the client side. And what else can we say? Interval. Let's change the interval to 10 minutes, for example. And we want to export the manifest. And just as before, I'm going to store that into the file, in the same staging file, staging YAML. So I'm going to append this definition into the staging YAML file. And this is the second definition. Now we got customization that tells Flux how to treat the manifests in the source that we created earlier. And this is important part. Almost everything in Flux consists of a source that is a reference to a Git repository, and customization or Helm release, some form of release definition that tells Flux, hey, this is a customization, these are customization files, or these are Helm files, and so on and so forth. Now I'm going to do the same thing for production. And to simplify my life, I'm going to copy and paste from my notes because the commands are the same. They're just having reference to a different Git repository, to production repository. So I did exactly the same with production. And there is one more thing missing, one more important thing missing. We are going to start thinking about the applications themselves. So I have a demo application stored in a repository vFarsig / DevOps Toolkit. So I want to create a source to that repository, reference to that repository. I could do it inside of staging and production repos, but it's better if I put it to the fleet repo, simply because the same reference to the same app repository will be used over and over again. Releases will be different in staging and production, but reference source is going to be the same. So Flux create source Git. I'm going to call it DevOps Toolkit. The URL is going to be https and then github.com/vfarsig/devops-toolkit. This is the existing repo. Branch is going to be master. Interval, what should I put? 30 seconds again. And I want to export that and pipe it all into T to DevOps, to the apps directory, DevOps toolkit.yaml. So what I did so far is just use CLI to create some YAML files. All I did was create YAML files, nothing else. And those YAML files are stored now in the fleet repo, in the local copy of the fleet repo. So I'm going to push those files to GitHub in this case. And that is, let me see, git add. I want to edit those files. I want to commit those files. Edit environments. And I'm going to push them. Now let's see what Flux thinks about me pushing those files to the fleet repo. I'm going to watch Flux to retrieve sources of type Git. And we can see that it already picked them up. There are 4 sources that it is monitoring, 4 Git repositories Flux is monitoring. There is DevOps Toolkit. This is the application that I will soon deploy to staging and production. Flux system. This is where Flux and all the sources references is stored. Production defines production, and staging defines staging. So far, for now, those are only the sources. Those are only references to Git repos. Sources are not going to deploy anything. It's just source code without any actions. Now, to see actions, we need to watch for Flux get customizations. And there are 3, and 2 of them are failing. Is this a disaster? No, not yet. Maybe it will be later. Right now, Flux detected 3 different customizations. Flux system, this is the setup of Flux itself, and production and staging. And it is complaining that there are no objects over there. That's because we did not push any definitions to staging or production. So it knows that it should monitor those repositories, but it did not find any Helm releases or any customizations over there. That's normal, we didn't create them yet. Now, let's deploy the first release and change this, remove this error message. Now we're finished with the setup. Now we can really go and do some GitOps with our application. Let's start with staging. So I'm going to go one directory back. So I'm going to go to the directory Flux staging, and I will create the first release. I'm going to express a desire to have a release of my application running in staging. But before I do that, I will need to create values file, because that release in staging will not use only the default values of my definition of that application. It will have to have few overrides. And the new values file that I will create is this one. This is a temporary file. It will not exist for long. So I'm specifying that, hey, I want to overwrite the tag of that release to be 2.9.9. I want that specific version running in staging. And I want ingress host to be this address, which is temporary domain of this cluster that I'm having. Cool. So those are the values that I will overwrite. It's a file that I will not need for long. It's very temporary. So let's create the first release, the first Helm release in staging. Flux create Helm release. I'm going to call it DevOps Toolkit, and the source will be Git repository, and it will be DevOps Toolkit. This is the source that I created and stored in the Fleet repo. It doesn't matter eventually in which repo you store stuff, because Flux picks that all up. Flux already knows that I have Git repo DevOps Toolkit because of the previous definition that I stored in Fleet. And what else do I need? So that's the source, DevOps Toolkit. I will tell it to use values from the values YAML file that I created earlier. I will tell you that it is chart Helm, meaning that in that repository of that application, there is a directory Helm that it should use to find the manifests. And the target namespace will be staging. I want to deploy this release in staging, and interval should be, what, 30 seconds again, sounds reasonable. And I want to export that manifest. And then I'm going to pipe all that to a file that will be appended to apps DevOps Toolkit. No, there is no need to append. This is the first time I'm creating that file. Apps DevOps Toolkit.yaml. So I created a file DevOps Toolkit.yaml, this time inside of the staging repository dedicated to defining the desired state of the staging environment. In this case, a namespace, it could be a whole cluster, does not really matter. And as you can see, the values were appended to that file, to the Helm release definition. So I don't really need the values file anymore. I'm going to remove it. I hope that the project will add set argument to Flux create, but so far I don't need this file anymore. Anyways, as you see, so far I'm not interacting with the cluster in any formal way, at least not to change the state. All I'm doing is interacting with Git. So I'm going to add those files, I'm going to commit, and it's going to be initial commit, and I'm going to push those changes. I'm pushing it to the Git repo, to staging repository right now, which, as you already know, Flux is monitoring through the source file. So watch Flux get sources Git. Actually, I already saw this. There is no need to watch the Git sources. I want to do something completely different. And that something completely different is I'm going to watch Flux get Helm releases. And you can see right now, reconciliation is already in progress. Flux already detected that I pushed the change to the staging repository, which is monitored by Flux because I created the source, and now it's finished. It deployed my release to staging, probably. Let's double check that. kubectl -- namespace staging get pods. And here we are. We can see that my application, GitOps Toolkit, is running in staging. And all I did was push a change to Git. And Flux is monitoring all the Git repositories that I defined as sources. Now, let's say that I want to change the release, to deploy a new release to staging. How would I do that? Let me think. Let me go and edit this file. I'm going to edit this file, and I'm going to change the tag to be 2.9.17. Saving the file, adding the file, committing the file, upgrade, and pushing the file to Git. So all I'm doing is pushing the file to Git. Now let's see what is happening. I'm going to watch kubectl -- namespace staging and get pods. And you can see that the new pod is already was creating, now it's running. The old release is already terminating. It is finishing the job. Come on. Terminate it. And there we go. The new release is running. The old one was destroyed. It used deployment strategy that was defined. In this case, rolling updates. It could be canary deployments, blue-green, does not matter. What matters is that as soon as I changed my desired state in a Git repo, that is reflected in a cluster. And the new release is running. And I can, let me show you. I'm going to copy and paste this command because it is a bit long. Here, this is the tag that is currently running in staging, 2.9.17. So it really did the right job. Now, the only thing missing is for me to say, hey, you know what? I want to promote that specific release to production. Let's say that I ran the tests, I reviewed the changes, I did everything I need to do. I'm confident that this is ready to be running in production. How would I do that? Let's see. cd flux production. I'm going to the local copy of the production repository. And I'm going to do the same thing as before for staging. Initially, I'm going to create the file that will overwrite the values. I'm going to create a Helm release, just as I did for staging. The only difference is that it is going to target the namespace production, and that it is using actually the same source, GitOps Toolkit, that is defined in the Fleet repo. So I'm just telling now in a different repository that I want this specific release of this application to be running in the namespace production. And I'm going to delete the values file. I'm going to add those files. Remember, now I'm working with the production repo, not with staging. That's the major difference. Git commit, initial commit, and git push. Now, let me watch Flux releases. Watch Flux get Helm releases. Actually, I'm not even gonna watch releases. I'm going to take a look at the pods. Namespace production, get pods. What is running in production? Nothing. Right now, nothing is running in production. Let's actually watch it. That's more interesting than repeating the same command over and over again. Typo. There we are. Actually, while I was figuring out my typo, my application is already running in production. That's about it. I have stayed. Now, if I would like to change, for example, the release in production, the logic would be the same. I would go to the file and I would just change, let's say, the tag to be, let's say that I want 18, right? Top, save the file, push to Git, and that's it. Change some definition, push to Git and let Flux take care of it. Now let's go back to the drawing board so that I show you what we did, what happened in the meantime since the last time I was drawing. So since then I created a repository. Actually, I already had a repository, a Git repository for my application app, and I added in the fleet repo, I added a source that is pointing to that repository. And from there on, Flux started monitoring that repo. And monitoring the repo as a source is not really doing anything. The magic happened. Let's say that this is staging section of the cluster, and that this is production stage section of the cluster or namespaces. Now, from there on, what I did is that as soon as I defined something is staging, Flux picked it up and deployed to staging. The moment I changed that definition in staging, Flux picked it up again and again redeployed it. Then when I added something to production repo, again, Flux picked it up, figured out the changes, and then deployed to the production namespace. In this case, it could be cluster, and so on and so forth. So as soon as I did change some definitions in staging, that's applied to the staging, in this case, staging namespace, staging cluster, staging whatever, and same thing for production. I could have additional repositories here, Git, and here, Git, and so on and so forth. I could have as many or as few repositories as I want, and as long as I tell Flux as long as I add source that points to one of those repositories here and there, Flux will start monitoring those repos, and from there on, it's all about adding releases, Helm releases, or customization files, or what's or not, to apply those desired states into the cluster. So that's it. That was Flux in 20 minutes or less. Actually, I did not track time. I almost certainly went over the 20 minutes for the demo. If I did, I apologize. But Flux has so many things that it is very tempting to go overboard. And it is, what can I say about it? Let me think. I think it's absolutely awesome. I think that what Vworks and the contributors to the project did with Flux 2 is absolutely amazing. Is it much better than Argo CD? No. It's a very tight race. It's a very close race. But so I cannot say which one is better, which one is worse. They're similar in what they do, but somehow different in how they do it. Argo CD has a single app definition that defines equivalent of Flux v2 sources and releases and customization. Flux is split into different resources, which might be more difficult to grasp. Learning curve is slightly higher, but on the other hand, the separation into sources and customizations and Helm releases and what's not allows us much more possibilities, much bigger number of permutations, and potentially much more power. I think that Flux v2 is accomplishing something that very few tools manage to do, and that is to be opinionated, to guide us towards certain outcomes while still being extremely flexible. Very flexible. The biggest difference between Flux v2 and the previous one is that flexibility. With version 2, you can do almost anything you want GitOps related, at least related to Kubernetes deployments and management of Kubernetes resources. It is absolutely awesome. And I'm really, really impressed what was done in the first iteration of the new major release. We're going to see, I will most likely make a new video, maybe half a year from now, and see how far both projects, Flux and Argo CD, went. But for now, Flux v2 is absolutely awesome. I might even say that until recently, my preference was for the Argo CD. Now, I think that I prefer Flux v2. but for a very narrow margin. It's a very close race. I might change my opinion half a year or months from now, but where Flux v2 is now, especially since it is the first iteration of the major release, it's absolutely amazing. The only thing I'm missing is UI, open source version of the UI like Argo CD has. So UI is a negative point, or not having UI is a negative point, at least not free version, open source version, part of the project. On a positive side, very flexible and potentially very, very powerful. It will be impressive to see where it will go from here. If you're not subscribed to the channel, subscribe right now. Subscribe. If you like this video, thumbs up immediately. If you want to support the channel, buy one of the courses or the books. Courses are on Udemy, books are everywhere or nowhere, I don't know. The links to all those things are below. The gist with all the commands is also below in the comment section. And what can I say? Flux, I'm really, really impressed with Flux v2. It took me a while. I made a mistake. I did not understand how it worked. That's why I created the video and now removed the previous video. So there is some work pending to do on documentation side. It is not really clear how it works, but once you figure it out, it's brilliant. And what I like the most, I forgot to say that, I like that it follows GitOps principles from the get-go. From the moment you decide to use Flux, it forces you in a way to use Git. And with Argo CD, you basically install Argo CD in a finicky way without really following GitOps principles, and from there on your applications are all GitOps and all that stuff. Bootstrapping in Flux v2 is also amazing. Anyways, I need to go. This is already much longer than it's supposed to be. Hey, see you next time. Cheers.